As American forces secured Caracas and Nicolas Maduro disappeared into military custody, something unprecedented happened in global commodity markets. Silver spiked 7% in 6 hours. Gold jumped 4%. Oil futures gapped higher by $8 per barrel. But here's what caught my attention, and what should terrify anyone who understands resource economics. Venezuela does not just sit on modest mineral deposits. It controls the world's largest proven oil reserves at 303.8 billion barrels, significant gold deposits estimated at over 12,000 tons, and serves as a critical logistics hub for South American mineral flows, including silver processing. The market response wasn't about Venezuela's 480 tons of annual silver production. It was about the sudden realization that a country controlling 18% of global oil reserves, substantial gold resources, and critical mineral infrastructure had just been removed from Chinese and Russian influence overnight. I've spent months analyzing how Venezuela's natural resource portfolio creates systemic risks that extend far beyond its borders. What I discovered is a perfect storm of resource concentration that makes the country's political stability a global economic variable. When that stability disappeared on January 3rd, it triggered commodity market responses that revealed vulnerabilities most traders never knew existed. Start with the scale of what changed hands. Venezuela's oil reserves alone represent roughly $18 trillion at current prices, more than the entire GDP of the United States. The Orinoco oil belt contains heavy crude deposits that, while expensive to extract, become increasingly valuable as global oil supplies tighten. These reserves have been largely offline due to sanctions and mismanagement, but they represent a strategic petroleum asset that could reshape global energy markets if properly developed. But oil is just the beginning. Venezuela's mineral wealth extends to gold deposits concentrated primarily in the Guayana region, where artisanal mining operations and larger industrial projects have identified substantial reserves. The United States Geological Survey estimates Venezuela holds approximately 12,000 tons of gold reserves, making it one of the world's top 10 holders of gold resources. Under the previous government, much of this gold was pledged to China and Russia as collateral for loans and development projects. The silver component of Venezuela's resource portfolio tells a different story. Annual silver production of 480 tons represents less than 2% of global output, but Venezuela's geographic position makes it a natural processing and distribution hub for silver concentrate from Peru, Bolivia, and northern Brazil. When American forces took control of Venezuelan territory, they didn't just capture modest mineral resources. They seized control of logistics infrastructure that connects South American mining regions to global markets. Chinese companies had invested heavily in this infrastructure, using it to create supply chains that bypassed traditional Western-controlled commodity flows. The immediate market response reflected this strategic shift. Silver lease rates spiked from 2.5% to 28% within hours, as traders realized that Chinese-controlled processing capacity in Venezuela was no longer accessible. Physical silver premiums jumped from $4 over spot to $16 over spot in London markets. Several major silver dealers stopped making markets altogether, unable to source adequate physical metal for delivery. Venezuela isn't the first resource-rich nation to experience sudden political change that realigned commodity markets. There's a pattern here, one that's been repeated across decades whenever strategic resources become concentrated in politically unstable or hostile territories. The pattern begins with resource discovery and development, usually by international companies seeking profitable extraction opportunities. Local governments, often lacking technical expertise or capital, partner with foreign entities to develop resource wealth. Everything appears stable until geopolitical alignments shift or resource revenues create internal conflicts that threaten supply security. Then comes intervention, sometimes economic, sometimes military, always justified by humanitarian concerns or security threats, but ultimately about resource reallocation. Consider Iraq's oil wealth. Before the 2003 invasion, Iraq held the world's second largest proven oil reserves at approximately 112 billion barrels. Saddam Hussein had aligned with Russia and France for oil development projects, effectively excluding American companies from Iraq's petroleum sector. The invasion changed that alignment permanently. Today, ExxonMobil, Chevron, and other Western companies hold major development contracts for Iraqi oil fields. The Iraq pattern established precedent for resource reallocation through military intervention. Initial justifications focused on weapons of mass destruction and regime change. Long-term outcomes involve fundamental restructuring of resource ownership and development partnerships. Libya followed a similar trajectory. Before the 2011 intervention, Libya produced approximately 1.6 million barrels per day and held Africa's largest proven oil reserves at 48 billion barrels. Muammar Gaddafi had been negotiating oil development agreements with Chinese, Russian, and European companies, while excluding American firms from major projects. The NATO intervention that removed Gaddafi was officially about protecting civilians and supporting democratic movements. The practical result was the restructuring of Libya's oil sector, with Western companies gaining access to development opportunities that had been closed during Gaddafi's rule. What makes Venezuela particularly significant is the scale of resources at stake and their integration with competing power bloc interests. Venezuela's 303.8 billion barrels of proven oil reserves exceed Iraq and Libya combined. The country's gold reserves of approximately 12,000 tons represent roughly 8% of global above-ground gold stocks. Venezuelan mineral processing infrastructure handles thousands of tons of regional precious metals flows annually. More importantly, these resources had become deeply integrated with Chinese and Russian economic systems. China's loans to Venezuela, secured by oil deliveries, totaled over $60 billion by 2020. Russian companies held major stakes in Venezuelan oil projects. Chinese firms controlled significant mineral processing capacity throughout the Orinoco mining arc. The January 3rd operation didn't just change Venezuelan politics, it severed Chinese and Russian resource supply chains that had taken years to establish. Oil commitments to China worth billions annually disappeared overnight. Russian energy investments became stranded assets. Chinese mineral processing operations lost their primary supply base. This resource reallocation has immediate implications for global commodity markets that extend far beyond Venezuela's borders. Chinese demand for alternative oil supplies increased pressure on Middle Eastern producers already dealing with capacity constraints. Russian energy companies lost a key ally in South America, just as European sanctions were reducing their traditional market access. But the deeper significance lies in the demonstration effect. The Venezuela operation proved that resource wealth doesn't provide protection against intervention when that wealth is controlled by governments aligned with competing powers. Resource-rich countries throughout the developing world must now factor military risk into their strategic partnerships. Countries like Iran, with its 208 billion barrels of oil reserves, or Bolivia, with its vast lithium deposits critical for battery production, suddenly face increased pressure to align with Western interests or risk similar intervention. The precedent established in Venezuela suggests that resource wealth can be forcibly reallocated when geopolitical interests require it. The historical pattern reveals a fundamental truth about global resource markets. Ultimate control belongs to powers capable of projecting military force, regardless of legal ownership or international agreements. Resource extraction may be technical and economic, but resource control is ultimately political and military. The numbers behind Venezuela's resource impact are staggering, and they reveal why the January 3rd operation created such immediate commodity market disruption. Let me walk through the mathematics that explain why a country most people couldn't locate on a map managed to move global silver, gold, and oil markets simultaneously. Start with oil, the foundation of Venezuela's resource wealth. At 303.8 billion barrels of proven reserves, Venezuela controls approximately 18% of the world's known petroleum resources. To put this in perspective, Saudi Arabia holds 267 billion barrels, and Russia holds 107 billion barrels. Venezuela's oil wealth exceeds the combined reserves of Iraq, Iran, and Kuwait. Under normal circumstances, Venezuela should produce 3 to 4 million barrels per day from these reserves. Economic mismanagement and sanctions reduced production to approximately 700,000 barrels per day by 2020, a 75% decline from peak capacity. This production collapse removed roughly 2.3 million barrels daily from global markets, creating artificial scarcity that supported higher oil prices throughout the past decade. The January 3rd operation immediately changed market calculations about Venezuelan oil availability. If production could be restored to even 2 million barrels daily under competent management, global oil supplies would increase by nearly 3%. In tight oil markets, supply increases of this magnitude typically reduce prices by 10 to 15%. Conversely, the uncertainty about how quickly this production might return to markets created volatility premiums that pushed oil prices higher in the immediate aftermath. Gold presents a similar mathematical dynamic. Venezuela's estimated 12,000 tons of gold reserves represent approximately 8% of total above-ground gold stocks worldwide. Much of this gold had been pledged as collateral for Chinese loans, effectively removing it from Western gold markets. The political transition potentially releases this gold from Chinese control, adding supply flexibility that could impact gold pricing over time. But here's where the mathematics become particularly interesting for silver markets. Venezuela's direct silver production of 480 tons annually represents just 0.05% of global silver consumption. In normal circumstances, losing this production shouldn't significantly impact global silver markets. However, Venezuela's role as a regional processing hub creates multiplier effects that amplify its market significance. Industry analysis suggests Venezuelan facilities processed 8,000, 12,000 tons of silver concentrate annually from neighboring countries, primarily Peru, Bolivia, and northern Brazil. This processing capacity represents roughly 3 or 4% of global silver refining capacity. When this processing capability disappeared on January 3rd, it created immediate bottlenecks in South American silver supply chains. The mathematical impact was immediate. Silver lease rates spiked from 2.5% to 28% within hours. This 1,000% increase reflected desperate demand for physical silver that could no longer be sourced through normal channels. Physical silver premiums increased from $4 to $16 per ounce in major markets, representing a 300% increase in the cost differential between paper contracts and actual physical delivery. These spikes occurred because silver markets operate on thin inventory buffers. Global above-ground silver stocks total approximately 1.1 billion ounces, roughly 13 months of annual consumption. Compare this to oil markets, where inventories typically represent 90 to 120 days of consumption. When Venezuelan processing capacity, representing 3 to 4% of global silver refining, disappeared overnight, it removed approximately 35 million ounces annually from supply chains already running deficits. The Silver Institute reports that global silver demand exceeded supply by 237.7 million ounces in 2024. Removing another 30 million ounces of processing capacity from deficit markets created immediate scarcity pressures. The Venezuela operation created a new paradigm for global resource markets, and silver is just the beginning of a much larger transformation in how strategic materials are controlled and distributed worldwide. Within 72 hours of the operation, resource markets began repricing risk based on military vulnerability rather than traditional supply-demand fundamentals. Countries controlling strategic materials now face a binary choice: align with Western security interests or risk forced resource reallocation through military intervention. This shift has immediate implications for silver markets. Peru produces approximately 3,200 tons of silver annually, roughly 12% of global output. Bolivia produces another 1,300 tons annually. Both countries have significant Chinese investments in mining infrastructure. Both countries now must consider whether their Chinese partnerships make them vulnerable to Venezuelan-style interventions. The mathematics are compelling. Peru's silver production alone represents 24 times Venezuela's domestic output. If processing disruptions in Venezuela could trigger 300% premium spikes in silver markets, imagine the impact if Peru's silver mines became inaccessible through political instability or foreign intervention. Major industrial consumers are fundamentally restructuring procurement strategies based on political risk rather than purely economic factors. Companies announce plans to source silver exclusively from politically allied producers, even at premium costs. Solar manufacturers are negotiating government-backed silver supply agreements that prioritize security over cost efficiency. This creates what economists call a resource bloc system, where commodity flows align with military alliances rather than economic efficiency. Western companies source materials from Western allied producers. Chinese companies source from Chinese aligned producers. Russian companies work with Russian allies. Silver markets already reflect this resource bloc premium. Australian and Canadian silver trades at $2 to $3 premiums over spot prices, while silver from politically uncertain regions trades at discounts despite identical quality. Industrial users pay these premiums willingly because supply security now outweighs cost optimization. The Venezuela precedent suggests resource bloc formation will accelerate as countries choose sides in an increasingly bipolar system. Nations controlling strategic materials must align with military powers capable of protecting resource investments, or risk having those resources forcibly reallocated. Chinese companies are rapidly diversifying silver processing operations across multiple countries to avoid single point of failure vulnerabilities. American companies are investing in domestic processing capacity to reduce dependence on potentially vulnerable foreign supply chains. This infrastructure diversification requires massive capital investments that increase silver supply chain costs while reducing political vulnerability. Industrial users ultimately pay for the security through higher silver prices, but they accept these costs as insurance against supply disruption risks. The Venezuela operation demonstrated that resource wealth provides power only when protected by military capabilities. Countries lacking military protection for their resource assets risk having those assets reallocated by powers capable of projecting force effectively. Silver markets reflect this transformation through price premiums that incorporate political risk assessments and military alliance considerations. The traditional commodity trading model based on quality, quantity, and price is being replaced by a resource security model that prioritizes political alignment and military protection. The Venezuela precedent established that strategic resources can be forcibly redistributed when political circumstances require intervention. This precedent will govern resource market behavior for decades, as commodity flows increasingly align with military capabilities rather than economic efficiency. The new resource reality means that silver and every other strategic material is now priced based on who controls it, who protects it, and who has the military capability to take it when necessary. Venezuela taught us that lesson with mathematical precision. Do you believe resource markets will stabilize under this new military-aligned system, or will resource competition escalate into broader conflicts as strategic materials become increasingly militarized?